Richard Benjamin Speck was not born into notoriety. He emerged from the margins of American society, shaped by instability, neglect, and a steady erosion of restraint. By the mid-1960s, he had become a drifter, moving through life without direction, accountability, or attachment. Violence did not suddenly enter his story. It accumulated slowly, embedded in a pattern of aggression, substance abuse, and disregard for consequence. Speck's early life was marked by dysfunction. Authority figures were inconsistent or absent, and discipline arrived sporadically, often through punishment rather than guidance. From a young age, he exhibited behavioral problems that escalated over time. School offered no structure he could accept. Employment never lasted. Relationships were volatile and short-lived. Each failure reinforced a growing hostility toward the world around him. By adulthood, Speck had developed a reputation for aggression fueled by alcohol. Drinking was not a habit, it was a constant state. Intoxication blurred boundaries and lowered inhibitions, allowing violent impulses to surface with increasing frequency. Arrests followed, but consequences were minimal. Short sentences and minor penalties did nothing to interrupt the trajectory. Instead, they normalized criminal behavior as an inconvenience rather than a deterrent. Chicago in the 1960s was a city of contrasts. Prosperity and decay existed side by side. For Speck, the city was not opportunity, it was anonymity. He moved through neighborhoods unnoticed, another transient figure in an urban environment accustomed to strangers. This invisibility provided cover. No one was watching closely. No one expected what was coming. On the night of July 13, 1966, Speck's internal instability aligned with opportunity. He was intoxicated, armed, and unrestrained. His movements that evening were not driven by a clear plan, but by a willingness to exploit circumstance. Violence did not require justification anymore. It existed as an option, always available. The townhouse on the south side of Chicago appeared ordinary. It housed student nurses, young women who represented care, order, and routine. The building was not fortified. There were no guards, no alarms, no sense of danger. It was the kind of place where trust was assumed. That assumption would be shattered permanently. Speck entered the residence and immediately asserted control. What followed was not an explosion of chaos, but a gradual tightening of terror. The environment shifted from safety to captivity in moments. The imbalance of power was absolute. The victims were isolated, confined, and unaware of the scale of the threat they faced. Over the course of the night, 8 nurses were systematically murdered. The violence was not impulsive. It was prolonged, deliberate, and escalating. Each killing reinforced the previous one, removing any remaining psychological barrier. Time lost meaning. The house became a closed system where fear replaced order and survival depended entirely on the whims of a single individual. The brutality of the murders shocked even seasoned investigators. The setting amplified the horror. This was not a dark alley or a remote location. It was a home, a place associated with care and safety. The contrast between who the victims were and how they died intensified the public reaction when the truth emerged. One victim survived by hiding, a detail that would later become central to the case. Her survival was not the result of intervention, but chance. The randomness underscored the fragility of life during that night. Survival was not earned or negotiated. It was accidental. By morning, the house was silent. What had occurred inside would soon reverberate far beyond its walls. The discovery of the bodies triggered a wave of shock that spread across Chicago and then the nation. The crime was immediately recognized as extraordinary in its cruelty and scope. Richard Speck did not flee with urgency. He did not disappear into darkness. His sense of invulnerability persisted. The violence, rather than exhausting him, seemed to affirm his dominance. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the consequences were inevitable, even if delayed. The murders of the 8 nurses would become one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Not because of mystery or complexity, but because of their raw, concentrated brutality. A single night. A single location. 8 lives erased. The city awoke to a crime scene that defied comprehension. Inside the townhouse, investigators encountered a level of violence that immediately signaled singularity. This was not a burglary, not a dispute, not an act of passion that burned itself out. The pattern suggested endurance, control, time. The victims had been held, moved, and killed across hours. The house itself bore witness to method rather than frenzy. Police response intensified rapidly. The scale of the crime demanded urgency, yet there was little initial clarity. No witnesses had seen the attacker arrive or leave. No alarms had been triggered. The neighborhood had slept through the night unaware that 8 lives were being erased behind closed doors. What little evidence existed had to be extracted from chaos. The breakthrough came from survival. One nurse had remained alive by hiding, unseen, unheard, and untouched as the killings unfolded around her. Her survival did not result from mercy or error, it was a fracture in the killer's control. From that fracture emerged description. She provided details that narrowed the field. Physical characteristics, demeanor, and behavior. The image was not precise, but it was enough to begin containment. At the same time, Richard Speck was unraveling elsewhere in the city. The violence had not calmed him. It had accelerated his instability. He moved through Chicago injured, intoxicated, and careless. A self-inflicted wound, sustained during the night, would become his undoing. Seeking medical attention, he entered a hospital not as a suspect, but as another anonymous patient in a city accustomed to disorder. Fate and procedure intersected quietly. A physician noticed a tattoo, distinctive, uncommon, and matching the description circulated among law enforcement. The recognition was not immediate certainty, it was suspicion sharpened by timing and context. Authorities were notified. The net tightened without spectacle. Speck was taken into custody without resistance. The absence of struggle was striking. There was no attempt to flee, no dramatic confrontation. The man responsible for 8 murders submitted to arrest with a composure that unsettled those present. The violence had already occurred. Control, in his mind, had been exercised. Capture was simply the next condition. As investigators began assembling the case, the weight of evidence grew quickly. Physical markers connected Speck to the scene. The survivor's identification solidified suspicion into certainty. The timeline aligned. His movements fit the gaps. The randomness that had initially protected him evaporated under scrutiny. Public disclosure of the arrest ignited national attention. Chicago reeled, then the country followed. The idea that one man could enter a residence and kill 8 women in a single night triggered a collective reckoning. Fear extended beyond the city. The crime violated assumptions about safety, proximity, and predictability. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. In custody, Speck's demeanor remained disturbingly flat. There was no visible collapse, no immediate reckoning with consequence. He appeared detached from the magnitude of what he had done, as if the murders belonged to a different context than his present confinement. This detachment would become a defining feature of the case. Investigators reconstructed the night meticulously. Each movement inside the house was charted. Each act of violence was placed within a sequence. The emerging picture was not one of sudden rage, but sustained dominance. The killings were spread across time, allowing for reflection and choice between each act. That reality deepened the horror. The opportunity to stop had existed repeatedly, and had been ignored. The role of alcohol was acknowledged but did not obscure agency. Intoxication did not explain duration, control, or escalation. The crimes required continued intention. The line between impairment and excuse was drawn clearly by the evidence. This distinction would later matter profoundly. As details reached the public, outrage intensified. Vigils were held. Names of the victims were spoken collectively, then individually. Each represented a future interrupted, a profession dedicated to care extinguished by violence. The symbolism amplified the tragedy. Nurses were not merely victims, they were embodiments of trust. Speck's arrest did not bring relief so much as confrontation. The question was no longer whether the killer would be found, but how society would respond. The brutality demanded accountability. The clarity of guilt narrowed options. The path forward moved toward trial with an inevitability shaped by evidence and public pressure. The survivor's role became central. Her existence challenged the finality Speck had attempted to impose. She represented both vulnerability and resilience, the thin margin between death and life that had separated her from the others. Her identification anchored the case in human testimony rather than abstraction. As prosecutors prepared charges, the narrative solidified. 8 murders. 1 night. 1 location. 1 perpetrator. The simplicity of the structure made the crime harder to rationalize and impossible to dilute. There were no accomplices to diffuse blame, no broader conspiracy to distract. Responsibility rested with one man. Richard Speck was no longer an anonymous drifter. He was a name attached to a singular act of brutality. The transition from offender to symbol happened quickly. His image circulated alongside the crime, binding identity to outcome. The city prepared for a trial that would test not only law, but endurance. The capture closed the search but opened the reckoning. What remained was judgment, legal, moral, and cultural. The night had ended. The consequences were only beginning. The trial of Richard Speck unfolded under the weight of national outrage. By the time the courtroom proceedings began, the crime had already etched itself into American consciousness. 8 nurses murdered in a single night, in one residence, without interruption. The simplicity of the facts made them unbearable. There was no mystery left to solve. Only accountability remained. The prosecution built its case on overwhelming evidence. The survivor's identification anchored the narrative in lived reality, transforming abstract brutality into testimony. Physical evidence corroborated her account. Speck's movements before and after the murders aligned precisely with the timeline established by investigators. His self-inflicted wound, treated at a hospital shortly after the killings, eliminated any credible alternative explanation. The case did not depend on speculation. It depended on sequence. Psychiatric evaluations were introduced, but they did not alter the direction of the trial. Speck's history of alcoholism, aggression, and instability was acknowledged without diminishing responsibility. He was not found legally insane. He was deemed capable of understanding his actions and the consequences attached to them. The murders were not impulsive eruptions, they were sustained acts carried out over hours. The court recognized duration as intent. Public reaction intensified as details were reiterated in formal proceedings. The repetition did not dull the impact. It sharpened it. Each recounting reinforced the reality that the killings were preventable only by the absence of the perpetrator. There were no systemic failures to absorb blame. The violence originated with one individual and ended only when he chose to stop. The verdict came swiftly. Speck was convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence reflected not only the number of victims, but the nature of the crime itself. 8 lives taken in a single confined space, over a prolonged period, constituted a level of cruelty that demanded the harshest response available at the time. The decision was framed as closure, a definitive statement against the scale of violence inflicted. Years later, the sentence would be commuted following changes in capital punishment law. Speck's punishment shifted from execution to life imprisonment. This alteration did not reduce the weight of the conviction, but it changed the endpoint of the story. The man responsible for one of the most infamous crimes in American history would not be executed. He would be confined indefinitely. In prison, Speck's notoriety did not fade. He became an object of morbid fascination, not for remorse or reflection, but for the absence of both. He adapted to confinement without visible transformation. Time did not soften him. Accountability did not reform him. The murders remained central to his identity, not as regret, but as fact. The trial concluded, the sentence imposed, and the legal system moved forward. Yet the event itself did not recede. The crime remained suspended in memory, fixed to a single night that refused to lose clarity. Justice had been administered, but resolution remained elusive. The murders committed by Richard Speck ended in the early hours of a Chicago morning, but their impact did not end with his capture or conviction. The townhouse where the killings occurred ceased to function as a place of residence. It became a symbol, an address stripped of normalcy. Walls that once enclosed routine now held the memory of confinement and fear. The space could be repurposed, but it could not be cleansed. For the families of the victims, time did not dilute loss. It reorganized it. The absence of 8 young women reshaped futures permanently. Careers ended before they began. Relationships dissolved into memory. The randomness of survival and death created a lasting sense of injustice that no verdict could fully correct. The crime offered no lesson that could undo its cost. Nationally, the case altered how violence inside private spaces was understood. The idea that a single individual could enter a home and exert complete control over multiple victims for hours challenged assumptions about safety and proximity. The murders demonstrated that danger did not require distance or spectacle. It required opportunity. The role of the lone survivor remained central to the legacy of the case. Her survival was not the result of intervention, negotiation, or rescue. It was chance. That fact remains one of the most unsettling elements of the story. Life and death were separated by inches, by silence, by timing. There was no moral logic to the outcome, only circumstance. Richard Speck died in prison years later, not as a transformed figure, but as the same individual who had entered the townhouse in 1966. His death closed a biological chapter, not a historical one. The crime did not diminish with his passing. It remained intact, preserved by its clarity and concentration. What makes the Speck murders endure is not complexity, but concentration. 8 victims. 1 night. 1 location. 1 perpetrator. The compression of violence into a confined time and space stripped away explanations that rely on chaos or confusion. The crime stands as a stark demonstration of how quickly order can collapse when control is seized by someone without restraint. There is no redemption in this story. No turning point that reframes the outcome. The legal system functioned as designed, but it could not restore what was taken. The crime did not change the world in policy or structure. It changed it in memory. The house went quiet again. The city moved on. New stories replaced old headlines. But the night itself never ended. It remains fixed, repeating in the historical record with the same intensity it carried when first discovered. Richard Speck did not become infamous because of mystery or ideology. He became infamous because of scale, proximity, and duration. His crime required no interpretation to be understood. It required only acknowledgement. The story ends where it began, in a place that should have been safe, during a night that should have passed unnoticed. What happened there remains one of the clearest reminders that violence does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply enters, closes the door, and takes its time.